Now, as we said, the bronchi are just two branches of the trachea that lead to the lungs. And when you have bronchitis, you have an inflammation of those bronchi. They become inflamed, they produce more mucus, uh, and it can be kind of painful, maybe even interferes with your ability to breathe. Now, once you get into the lungs, yeah, the lungs are going to be the place where gas is exchanged between the external environment and the blood, and the lung is divided into 5 lobes. Your right lung has 3 lobes, and your left lung has 2 lobes. And the reason why your left lung has 2 lobes and your right has 3 is because your heart, which is positioned kind of like in between the two lungs, your right lung and left lung, is actually more on the left side, and it's taking up some of the space of the lung. So your left lung is just a bit smaller than your right lung. Now, each lobe of the lung receives a separate branch of the bronchus. Bronchus is singular, bronchi is plural. And then each bronchus divides up into bronchial tubes. And these will then, so here's your trachea. There's the left bronchus. Remember, person is facing us, so that's on his left side. Those are the bronchial tubes. And then the bronchial tubes are broken into bronchioles. So each part is getting divided smaller and smaller and smaller. And then at the end of the bronchioles is what we call the alveolus. Okay, so there's the bronchioles, and they are divided up even smaller into these little microscopic bubble-like sacs called the alveoli. And they kind of look like grapes. And the outside of each of alveolus is covered by a small or a very extensive network of small blood vessels called capillaries. And you can see the red capillaries and blue capillaries. The red capillaries means that it's trying to show you that's the part that's carrying oxygenated blood, and the blue side, which is not really blue, but is the blood that has been deoxygenated. It has less oxygen on that side. And you have a lot of these alveoli in your lung. It says in your book that most lung tissue is composed of about 3 million of these. So you have a lot of these tiny little ones in your lungs. Now, the close physical relationship of the alveoli and the blood capillaries provides rapid exchange of carbon dioxide out of the blood and into the lungs, or oxygen from the lungs and into the blood. So they're bubble-like sacs. They're surrounded by lots of capillaries. Now, you may have heard of some people who have emphysema, and emphysema is just a long-term progressive disease of the lungs, and it causes shortness of breath. And the reason why is it's due to an overinflation of the alveolus. So you can see the numbers that they're talking about right over here this is the pressure inside your lungs, and this is the pressure here. And remember that air always moves from high pressure to low pressure. So it will move in to the alveoli sacs where the oxygen can get into the uh, the uh, the bloodstream, the capillaries. Now, one more thing yet about the lungs is that the outside of the lungs has a very delicate membrane called the pleura, and it lines both the inside of your chest cavity, your thoracic cavity, and there's also one that lines the outside of your lungs. So there's actually like two layers, and in between these two layers, we call it the pleural space, and the pleural space is filled with a fluid, a pleural fluid we call it, and it lubricates these two membranes so that they don't rub on each other as you inhale and exhale, which would make it very painful when you're breathing. And so if something happens to inflame those membranes, the pleura, you can experience something called pleurisy. It's very painful as you inhale and exhale, but it's because these membranes have become inflamed for some reason due to maybe an infection or something like that. So in between these two layers is called a pleural space, and it's filled with a pleural fluid. And then we talked about pleurisy is if you have an inflammation of that. Now, asthma is another disorder of the respiratory system, and it's a chronic breathing disorder. And what it does is it causes your bronchioles to become constricted. That means to become smaller, like it does over on the right side. And often people who have trouble with asthma will have an inhaler. They'll usually take a couple puffs of their inhaler, and it will cause the walls of the bronchioles to dilate. That means shrink, to get bigger around to allow more air to pass through on their way to the alveolus. So it would become more like the one on the left after they've taken their inhaler. And then pneumonia is another disorder of the respiratory system. And pneumonia is just an inflammation of the lung. It's usually caused by an infection. And there's different kinds of pneumonia. There's viral pneumonia and bacterial pneumonia. And it causes the bronchioles to become inflamed, as well as mucus to fill up these alveoli. And you can see that's going to make it very difficult to breathe. And if that's not stopped, or if the body doesn't, get a handle on the infection, you could see it could ultimately lead to asphyxiation, and the person could die from that. So you can see that in the bottom picture, the alveolus is filling with mucus, and the bronchiole is inflamed. And so an inhaler causes it to dilate, which means to get bigger around like it is in the top picture. Okay, so that takes us through the anatomy of the respiratory system. Tomorrow we'll actually talk about respiration. How does the body take oxygen in and out? In other words, how does it function? Turning now more to the physiology of respiration. Respiration is usually divided into three phases. The external respiration, that involves the exchange of gases in the air between the alveoli in your lungs and the blood. Then we have internal respiration. That's the exchange of gases between the blood and the body cells. And then we have cellular respiration, which we have talked about before. This is the use of oxygen by the body cells in converting glucose and other energy storing substances into water and carbon dioxide and energy. Now, it's cellular respiration that requires oxygen from the air we breathe. And then carbon dioxide we breathe out comes from cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is kind of like the turning point. The mechanics of breathing, or the mechanism of breathing, breathing involves the movement of outside air into the alveoli and then out again. And inspiration is the word that we use for filling our lungs with air. And then the expiration is the forcing of air out of our lungs. So inspiration is like when we inhale, and then expiration is like when we exhale. The act of breathing involves the movement of air into our body, and during inspiration, the diaphragm is going to be contracted. It's going to move down, become flatter. Also at the same time, the ribs are going to move upward and outward, and that is going to increase our chest cavity. So it's going to the chest cavity will have a greater volume, and as you increase the volume, you reduce the pressure that's in the lungs, and so that allows air to rush from outside our body through our nose or mouth, down the trachea, and into the lungs. When we exhale, the diaphragm is going to be relaxed. The ribs are going to lower, and that's going to compress the lung tissue. It's going to go back to its normal size, and that's going to decrease the volume in my chest. And when that happens, that increases the pressure in my lungs, and air always moves from high pressure to low pressure. So if the pathway from the lungs out through your nose or mouth is totally open, the air will automatically come out. You will exhale.